Завжди можна взяти у нас ще є киць. Всім доброго вечора. I will start a few words in Ukrainian and then we'll switch into English. Ми будемо мати потім запис. І всім доброго вечора і вітаю вас у Центрі міської історії. Ми будемо мати сьогодні розмову і довкола книжки, але також ширше. Але насамперед я представлю наших гостей. I'm really honored and pleased to have you both here. I would like to thank Book Forum to begin with, because Book Forum brought you here. You came to Book Forum, and we catch the opportunity to have you here. And so Ketrін Yanger, historian, permanent fellow of Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Kate's research is very connected to Galicia, 19th century, interplays of religion and power, and more broadly with the imperial governments and imagination and politics. And at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna for several years, Kate is running a program, Ukraine in European Dialogue. And this year, she is running a very important program, and on that we will speak on Monday, called Documenting Ukraine, which does an incredible job of enabling people to document and to work and to live. I think that's really and Filipa Sends, it's always a pleasure and incredible joy to not only introduce you, but to welcome you again and again in Lviv. And Filipa Sends is professor of international law, is practicing barrister lawyer. Now it's not QC, it's KC. King's Counsel. So
he went to bed at Queen's Counsel and woke up at King's Counsel.
It doesn't sound as good somehow. So very much known in Ukraine and Lviv as an author of book East West Street, which is available in Ukrainian. The second one, Red Line, we hope will come in Ukrainian as well soon. But we will talk today about the book which just appeared. And in this conversation, I would like to begin with that you've been here like a year ago, like almost exactly. It was the beginning of October. It's a year. It was a year. I think it was a year. Yeah. Just really, it was a year ago. It was a year ago, and it's not too often, never too often, you know. And you have an event about Stanislav Lem at the City Hall, and that's right, you know, it was actually 100 years, and we talked about a couple of big themes, which I think will resonate here, and I think in our conversation it would be good to go first almost 8,000 kilometers from Ukraine south, but also come back. And it's a question of return, it's a question of lost home, and it's a question of how those who have power can do great misjustice to those who have less or no, and how we can, and who, and where, and when can do justice. And this is the story that you tell. I think that you didn't have the chance to read the book, so the book will be in the library, say, from Monday, so please come. We do hope that the book will be translated at some point, even if Ukraine is not at the core, but it does have a relevance, as we'll try to explore with you today. Somewhere at some place you write that you were feeling like you didn't know how it happened, but you didn't know that, you knew that Britain was a colonial state, and there's a huge legacy of colonialism, but that there was this colony. And so if you just begin and tell a bit of your story, because this book has your personal journey as a citizen, but also as a lawyer and as a human being.
Well, it's incredibly nice to be back in Lviv. I've just arrived literally 1 hour ago via Krakow, and then the car journey over the border, and we did not have a long wait. We travelled together. It's very smooth. And I think in many of us there's an intense feeling of solidarity. I think we all, went and spoke to people we know. Is it safe to come? And our families are worried because we're in a country there is a war. But I think we really wanted to come, and it's really important. I think we are very pleased to be here with you all, and I think you can take our presence as a symbol, essentially, of total solidarity with you at this time. So there are many points of connection between this story and East West Street and the Rat Line, but one of them, which you won't be aware of, is that both stories began in April 2010, and I received 2 unexpected communications in April 2010. One communication we've talked about many times from the University of Lviv. I received an invitation to give a lecture on the cases that I do on crimes against humanity and genocide. And I think I've said it before, where is Lviv? What is Lviv? I Googled it, and I saw that Lviv was Lvov, and it was Lemberg. And my grandfather used to speak about Lemberg because he was born here on Sheptytsky Street, one of the 2 Sheptytsky Streets. So I thought, oh yeah, I definitely want to come here. And then from that emerged this whole project from a single invitation, one thing. All these seeds followed. But that same month, in April, I received another communication from the Prime Minister of a tiny African country called Mauritius. Would I be willing to be the lawyer for Mauritius to try to recover a part of the territory of his country which had been stolen and colonized and occupied illegally 50 years earlier in 1965. And the islands, there are 58 of them, are called Chagos. And they are in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They are an archipelago. They were part of Mauritius as a British colony from 1814 until 1965. And then in 1965, the British government decided to give one of the islands to the United States as a military base, a famous island called Diego Garcia. It is from Diego Garcia that the bombing of Baghdad began in March 2003. That is another illegal war, which I thought was illegal from the first moment, as illegal as the Russian occupation of Ukraine. I draw no moral distinction between those 2 conflicts. They are both, for me, a crime of aggression. And it's also the place where the Americans, when they basically kidnapped people off the streets of Pakistan and Afghanistan, would fly them to Diego Garcia, and it was used as a black site before being transferred to other places. We don't know whether torture was performed there, but we know that it was a stop-off place for people who were then taken to be tortured. So the context was that in 1964, Britain declined to participate in the Vietnam War. And the British government felt compelled, when requested by the Americans to help them, to give them one of the islands. And the problems that the British faced was in the 1960s, there was the move towards decolonization. It started in 1941 with a document called the Atlantic Charter, then the United Nations Charter, committed the colonial powers of Europe to give independence to their colonies. And in 1960, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution, 1514, very important in the context of Ukraine also today, the right of self-determination and territorial integrity. So it's very connected. And the UK faced demands from the people of Mauritius to obtain their independence. And in essence, what happened was the British said to the Mauritians, we will give you your independence if you let us have the Chagos archipelago. And an agreement was made under duress, under pressure. And the British separated the Chagos archipelago from Mauritius and created a new colony that was the last colony created by the United Kingdom, the British Indian Ocean Territory, and gave a lease of 70 years to the United States for the military base on one of the islands. But the British faced a problem because under the rules of international law, decolonization, self-determination, territorial integrity, the colonizing power could only cut off a part of the country. Again, this is very relevant in relation to the referendums, so-called, which are taking place here, if the consent of the affected population has been obtained. So the British, like the Russians, I'm sorry to say, decided that the affected population was not the whole of Mauritius, just as the Russians have decided it's not the whole of Ukraine. It's only the people living in the Chagos archipelago, just as the Russians have said it's only the people living in Donetsk and the other places where they've had so-called referenda. It's exactly the same thing. What the British did, knowing that the people of the Chagos archipelago, just like the people of Mauritius, would not accept to be separated and to be subject to the new colony, chose another technique. The numbers are much smaller than in relation to eastern Ukraine, 2,000 people. All of them black, and all of them descendants of enslaved people who have lived there for generations. And what the British did from one day to the next was recharacterize the people living on the islands. They ceased to be inhabitants and they became contract laborers, workers, who had been taken to the islands to work. It was absurd. Some of them were children of 10 years or 5 months or 3 months, or anything like this. And they then, between 1968 and 1973, removed the entire population and sent them to Seychelles, to Mauritius, to the United Kingdom. And these people have wanted to go back ever since. Mauritius was given its independence in 1968. It was a very poor country, tiny population, 600,000 or 700,000, against the United Kingdom and the United States, permanent members of the Security Council. And for 15 years, Mauritius was completely dependent economically on the United Kingdom. Its only product was sugarcane, and its market was the United Kingdom. So for 15 years it did nothing. And then in 1982, slowly it started saying, what has happened is illegal, you have to recover, and so on and so forth. And eventually, after another 30 years, in 2010, I get called up by the Prime Minister of Mauritius, can you construct a legal strategy for us to recover our islands? And the book tells the story of how we designed the legal strategy, but it tells it around a single person, a remarkable woman who is now 70 years old, whose name is Lizeby Elíse, who cannot read and cannot write, but who at the age of 20 was told from one day to the next, you will leave tomorrow and you're allowed to take one suitcase. when she told me that, I've come to know her very well, it reminded me of my great-grandmother in Vienna in 1942, who was told, you're leaving tomorrow, one suitcase. And there are people, maybe in this room, or your families, or your friends, who know right now the experience of what it means to be told, you get out tomorrow, one suitcase. So there are all of these points of connections. We can come back to the story. The upshot was, and I just want to finish by making one more significant connection with what's happening here and the complexities of the situation. Because the world is a really complex place. The case goes to the World Court by an amazing amount of work by incredible Mauritian diplomats, supported by the whole of the African Union. And here is where it gets complex, with the strong support of Russia and China. We want to use the story to hit the British and the Americans. We can come back to the levels of complexity. Fortunately for me, the Russian support occurred in the critical years was 2016, 2017, 2018, before these latest horrors happened. But already then, there had been Crimea, I had been the counsel for Georgia against Russia, another case at the International Court of Justice. So frankly, me working with Russia has been pretty complex. And there was a certain moment where I was instructed by the Prime Minister to go and negotiate with the Russians the resolution at the UN on sending the questions to the International Court of Justice. And the Russians said, we want to meet the team in Moscow. And I said, no, I'm not going to Moscow. We'll meet in Geneva, and we'll do the negotiation in Geneva. And that was in part, by then I had a strong connection with Ukraine, a strong connection with Lviv, and it was just not something I was going to do. The case goes to the International Court, and the court ruled unanimously, in effect, no objections on the merits for Mauritius against the UK and the US. It then goes to the General Assembly, which orders the United Kingdom to leave its illegal occupation of Chagos, Mauritius, and Africa by November 2019. And the UK government refuses to leave. On the other hand, you do need to know there is huge support in the United Kingdom for Ukraine. So I think you can feel very comfortable knowing that the support of the United Kingdom is not encapsulated in a single individual or prime minister or political party. It's across the board, and it's total support. So you can feel very, very comfortable. But the refusal of the United Kingdom to act on these international decisions has had very significant consequences for you. And I can tell you for a fact, you know that not a single African country is voting for the resolutions at the UN, adopting sanctions, participating on the accountability conferences in The Hague. That is not because these countries are against Ukraine, not at all. Nor is it that they are in favor of Russia. I can tell you, I work with a lot of them, they're not. What it is a sense of absolute disgust at the double standards and hypocrisy of countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. And many African prime ministers, foreign ministers, ambassadors at the UN, ambassadors elsewhere have said to me, what are we supposed to do as African countries when the United Kingdom and the United States come to us and say to us, help us with Ukraine, help us against Russia. And we say to them, but you're occupying illegally a part of our territory. Why do you have this double standard in relation to what is going on now? And this helps you understand a little bit, I think, this tremendous sense of hypocrisy and double standard on all sides in relation to these kinds of questions. But the beating heart of the Chagos story is absolutely connected to the beating heart of the Ukraine story. It is about the right of a people determined for itself how they will be governed. It's about respect for the principle of territorial integrity. It's about respect for people to return to their homes and live where they want to live, under a government they want to live under. So this is a much smaller story, in a sense, the Ukraine story and the Russia story. The numbers of human beings are much smaller. The territory actually is probably larger, because it's 640,000 square kilometers. It is huge, and it is of enormous geopolitical and military interest, because the strategic location is absolutely significant in relation to the East-West conflict that is underway right now. But it's a way of introducing this story to get you to think, as I think you understand anyway, that nothing is ever quite what it seems, and there are a multitude of complexities. Let me stop there and put it back over to you.
I would ask to Kate, but actually with something to pick up from your introduction and with empires, because this is what he studied, and I think that we feel a bit of unease when we say that, when we say that Britain and Russia are the same.
I didn't say that.
You didn't say that. Okay, so in the case,
I choose my words very, very carefully.
So, okay, let's actually, if we feel uncomfortable if we put in one frame somewhere or close to each other. I think it's also a moment with uncomfortable, when we feel uncomfortable, just to dig deeper and ask more. So why do we feel that? From where it comes? And I think that so we do know that empires are perceived and also self-fashioned. And you, as a historian, if you can walk us a bit through this imperial geographies and legacies.
To that. Yeah, I was fascinated while reading this, Philippe, because of the different ways into basically you're taking this imperial story and putting it into a timeline that we're not used to thinking of, right? We're not used to thinking of new colonies in the second half of the 20th century. And I think that brings to light a lot of the logics of empire that we perhaps sometimes have forgotten to look for. Right, so one of them, I think, that becomes very clear here has to do with, as you say, this question of scale. And this question of how many people does it take for something to matter? And is 2,000 people's lives being affected a fair trade-off? For example, if we're in the middle of the Cold War and we can say, well, we need this to defend the free world, right? Then it becomes an imperial logic that says, we are doing this on behalf of many other people. We will overlook the rights of these individual people. So I see imperial logic functioning in that way. I also see a disruption of our notions of what constitutes an empire through the US's role in this story as well. I mentioned this to you today. There was a fantastic book a few years ago by a historian named Daniel Immerwahr called How to Hide an Empire. And this, in this, he makes this claim that in fact, we have to understand the US as an empire as well, one that does not annex, acquire territory, but rather projects its power through positioning military bases, through acquiring resources, through all of those sorts of things. And so what you bring out here makes clear that empires can take a lot of different forms. And I think that is such an important discussion to be having now, when we, coming from the Ukrainian context, are trying to make an argument about the relevance of the decolonial frame in making sense of Russia, right, is to say, empires are not necessarily just one thing. They look in a lot of different ways. And so my question to you here would be, what does imperialism look like in this story? How do you understand the British Empire functioning, all of that?
I'm so pleased we're having this conversation. So one of the aspects that I've touched with in this book also, although I've tended to underplay it when talking about it, is my own journey, my own personal journey. As an international lawyer who was once, like many of you, a law student and who looked at the world in a particular way and was taught things in particular ways. I had wonderful teachers of international law, the most famous international lawyers in the world, Elie Lauterbach, Sir Robert Jennings, Derek Bowett, Christopher Greenwood. all white men,
Yes.
not a single woman, not a single person who did not have a white skin. The first time I describe in the book, when I was 22, I went to America and I spent a year as a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School. And I said openly, but with a sense of shame, very surprised when I sat in on a course on international law and a black man taught me a course on international law. So I've questioned myself, how could it be that, today it's not a surprise. I teach all over the world, people of all different backgrounds and colors and identities. But when I was 22, I was like, wow, okay, this is different from what I'm used to. So I went back to my own education and I found my school history book, which was published in 1966. And it was called This Is Your Century, by a man called Jeffrey Treese. And chapter 8, I think it was called Sunset on Empire. The reason that I'm explaining this is we're all products of what we're taught. And, I'm not apologizing for my failure to know until I was 50-year-old where Chagos was. I didn't know where the Viv was. I didn't know where the Chagos archipelago was. Like, we live in our little worlds and we deal with the things that we can deal with. So in the attic, I had my copy of This Is Your Century. We were 12 years old, 13 years old, so 72, 73, so 50 years ago. It is shocking. I mean, you've seen it. I mean, I'll just give you a couple of examples, okay? How my mindset was formed as a 12-year-old on, in answer to your question, matters of empire. There is this place called India. We used to run it. And when we ran it, the governor was this magnificent human being called Viscount Mountbatten, the cousin to the Queen. No, I mean, it's cringe-making. He was tall, and he had a lot of medals, and he wore hats with feathers in, and he looked great. And then he was replaced by a little man, a thin man, who wore a loincloth. He was vegetarian. He was pacifist. He looked like a monkey with glasses. Whoa, okay? So imagine little English boys reading about empire and history. And then you get to the end of the chapter, and this is how the chapter ends. The famous historian, Mr. Treese, tells us, at the end of the day, this issue of colonialism and empire, it's like the parent and the child. The child is growing up and it wants a toy and it wants a chocolate biscuit and it makes a fuss and it shouts and it cries and it screams and it wants this and it wants that. And eventually the parents say, okay, you can have the book, you can have the toy, you can have the chocolate biscuit. Just shut up. Okay, leave us alone for a bit. And then the child grows up and the child realizes that all the time the parents were right. They knew how to do things correctly. Okay? So put that into your own context in Ukraine, okay? Because it's going to be the same kind of analysis that is being taught in certain parts of the world. Okay, they made a fuss, we gave them Crimea, back in the 50s it was a mistake, and now they've grown up and they haven't quite realized that we were right, but it's the same kind of parallel analysis. You need to understand that when I was growing up, I learned not a single word about the British Empire, except it was great. We gave them railways, we gave them education, we gave them schools, we gave them the rule of law, we gave them the court system, everything they have, they learned from us. And that is what you need to know. We learned nothing about slavery and enslavement. We learned nothing about uprisings and British concentration camps and mass murder on an industrial scale across the world. Not a single word about any of this. And still today, Britain has real difficulty coming to terms with its past. You probably don't know, I'll give you one fact, which is unbelievable. That Britain celebrates itself as the country that ended slavery, okay? But it says nothing about its role in running, inventing, applying, nothing at all. Nor does it say anything about the fact that when slavery ended, first the trade in slaves and then the act of slavery, the British Parliament thought, actually, this is really bad. We need to pay compensation. Okay. So who gets compensation? The slave owners. The slave owners get billions in compensation. The slaves don't get anything. They've never had anything, which is why African countries and Caribbean countries are now saying, hey, we want compensation for the way that we were mistreated. The British government only stopped paying compensation 4 years ago. Okay? The debt was so enormous that the government had to borrow such huge amounts of money to pay the slave owners, to compensate them for the loss of their slaves. The debt was only paid off finally, the last bit of interest, 4 years ago. And the people who got compensation are today in Britain the principal landowners. Okay, so we live with a legacy of empire. That's the simple answer to your question. And until recently, I and most people did not ask ourselves any questions about these things. So, like many countries, Ukraine, France, Mauritius, it's the same. There's these bits of our history we don't like so much, so we push it under the carpet and we don't teach it at school, and we don't tell our children about it, but it comes back later on.
It comes back, and you know, I think this is also somewhere in your book, is that how things do speed up and change, because we do have a whole different access to information that you can find. You know, I mean, information is somewhere there, doesn't mean that you will reach out to it, but even in your place, you know, how you could reach, I mean, how things and connections can be made. And this is like my question, because the way I read the book, there are many heroes, but I put with a remarkable, amazing woman, Liseby Elysé, and another protagonist, which is not of human nature in a way, but made the collective, is court. So they are kind of almost the same age. The court is 45 year born, 1945. Liseby is born 1953.
The year of the Queen's coronation.
So they almost, they're almost the same generation, slightly. And as I was following the book, I think that the court is changing, and it's a part of something that we wrote that justice takes time, and as does take time unlearning imperialism. It doesn't seem that it will be anytime soon over, because it's such a huge legacy that we will be, those impacted, involved, will be untithing and unwrapping it. But still, there is this injustice. It's a big part of your book, and your work is wandering, to quote you, the corridors of these courts, couple of courts. And it's changing. It's not changing by itself. It's changing by decisions people make, the judges who sit, and also conscious decision. For example, how you were saying that judges have to come from different parts of the world, that judges have to be diverse, because it does impact the decision, and then decision impacts other decision and others. It's like a web that you are contributing and moving. So now I'm living, because so this is the universe, in a way, legal universe, which became recently so important for Ukraine, because this is some justice, future justice will be. And in your story and your experience, it's like how you talked with Kate, how you use this here, an opportunity here, opportunity there, a possibility that is created. And then, you know, my question would be, are we in the moment, or are we living through the experience that can lead to more profound rethinking of the international justice to deal with the scale, the fact that very powerful state with nuclear can do, because that's actually something for what we need justice, that states or people who have more power cannot do things to those who have less. Or should that matter? Or just world? You know, so something that, you know, how are the prospects from you walking the corridors of courts, how court system, international court system is changing as we are now sitting here in the midst of the biggest wars.
And the one thing that I would add to that question, because I was thinking about this so much myself, has to do with the fact that the courts themselves are made up of individuals, right? And you pointed at this in your question. But I think one of the things that comes through so strongly here is it's so dependent on where the perspective that they're bringing to these discussions. And these courts are very easy for us who aren't there walking the corridors to see them as faceless institutions, as monoliths, right? Kind of putting a decision down from on high. And so it'd be super interesting to hear you talk a little bit more about how you encounter these courts and how you see them changing in the future as well.
Well, just to start at the end of the story, I mean, obviously you in Ukraine are living through this extraordinarily complex, painful, but also curiously, I mean, uplifting moment, because something is happening that is pretty amazing for those of us who are outside this country, to see the spirit with which a country is resisting. And we've all noticed that, and we're very struck by that. And for those of us who are attentive to international law, we're also very struck by the way in which legal narrative plays an absolutely central role in the political and diplomatic campaign to basically evict Russia. And we notice that the issue of criminality, war crimes, crimes against humanity, allegations of genocide, the crime of aggression, is part of that frame and that agenda. And I've been asking myself the question, how could it be that the government of Ukraine has taken such a strong legalistic line? It's very, very interesting. And I have some answers to that. I have some sense of that. I mean, I think in part it is connected to the fact that a lot of the people who are involved in decision making actually know a lot about international law. So I've been working informally with Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister. I'd written an opinion piece in the Financial Times 3 days after the war began to basically say there are these 4 crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, crime of aggression. But actually, the only one that really matters in this case is the crime of aggression, because it's the only one that leads to the top table with any degree of certainty, Mr. Putin, Mr. Lavrov. And it will be a disgrace if in 3 or 4 years' time we have trials for low-grade people who've committed atrocities in Bucha or Izium or other places, but the top people are still all in power, and that has to be avoided at all costs. Turned out that Dmytro Kuleba had, as a student, written a paper on the London Declaration of 1942, the St. James's Declaration, where governments in exile from Europe gathered in London, led by the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, various other countries, and adopted a declaration saying, we commit the prosecution of Nazi war criminals once the war is over. And of course, in January 1942, everyone just thought, this is a very nice, lovely idea, aspiration, but it's never going to happen. It's crazy. But of course, was it so crazy? It happened. We had Nuremberg. And the heart of Nuremberg, I mean, I know in East West Street I talk about crimes against humanity and genocide, but actually the beating heart of Nuremberg, 80% of the trial was about crimes against peace, the crime of aggression. Because, as the judges said in that case, as for the current situation, if there hadn't been a war, they having ruled that they only had jurisdiction from September the 1st, 1939, so you had to show that the crimes were committed in the context of war. Without the war, there would have been no jurisdiction, there would have been no crimes, there would have been action. And basically, it's the same situation here. So, absolutely, we should be focusing on every single war crime and crime against humanity that is perpetrated. I have to say, just to be very clear, because I've got 2 days of talking about these issues, on my interpretation of the law of genocide, I don't see what is happening on the territory of Ukraine as a genocide. There is genocidal rhetoric, but I think it would be very hard in law to sustain the argument that what's happening is a genocide. War crimes, yes. Crimes against humanity, yes. But crime of aggression, absolutely. I mean, that is the easiest one of all the crimes to prove, right to the very top, for 10 or 12 people, right at the very top. And Ukraine is pushing that, and it's supported now by 6 or 7 countries. What's going to happen? Well, there have already been some court cases. Some of us are watching with a slight distaste in our mouths the jurisdictional battles between the International Criminal Court and the public prosecutors in Ukraine over who's going to prosecute these particular crimes. Again, this is very connected to these stories. The International Criminal Court has a big problem. It has basically only indicted and prosecuted black people. Okay? Sorry to put it in these terms. Black people don't have a monopoly on international crime. And when the ICC has had jurisdiction over Brits in Iraq or Americans in Afghanistan, it's sort of gone, oh, no, we don't really, no, politics, big power politics. They'll cut the money off if we start investigating these people. So African countries are pretty furious with the International Criminal Court. And this is part of the reason why the International Criminal Court, frankly, is desperate to find some Russians or Russian-supporting people to prosecute. Because then we can have an answer to all these African countries who are saying, actually, there's some justification. You're only prosecuting black people. Why don't you find some white people to prosecute? That's what's going on. That's the reality that people don't want to talk about. And that's why, in part, Western countries are pumping ridiculous sums of money into supporting ICC investigations. That's what's going on here. There's another geopolitical context that people don't really want to talk about. And when push comes to shove, is Ukraine really going to hand over to an international court the most serious perpetrators of crimes committed on its territory? No, it's not. Because as many of you know here, as international law students or practitioners, the ICC has a principle of complementarity. It is first and foremost for the country in which the crimes are committed to investigate and to prosecute. And it's only if that country is unwilling or unable to do that that it goes to the international level. So of course, Ukrainian prosecutors, the moment they catch people who they could prosecute, they're going to say, we can do it very well. We have judges, we have courts, we have laws, we can do all of this. So this is becoming extremely problematic, and the problematics are being enhanced, again, with a different type of neo-imperial thing. It is not helpful for legitimacy around the world for the prosecutor or the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to be parading around on international television programs around the world with ministers from Western countries who want him to prosecute Russians. Okay? As a prosecutor, you have to be really independent. And the moment people have the sense that the office of the prosecutor is in the pocket of any particular countries that have their own agenda and their own interests, the legitimacy of that institution is under fire. So, to understand what is happening now, you've got to put it in this broader geopolitical context. And you've got to play a really smart game in terms of getting as many countries on board as possible to justify it. Coming to your central question, at the end of the day, it is not states or courts as such that take the decisions that matter. It is individuals. This is a fundamental tension in my book East-West Street, the relationship between the individual and the group. It permeates everything. When you're making an argument in an international court of justice, when I stand before the ICJ on the last colony, I don't have a collective of 14 judges in front of me. I have 14 individual human beings, each with their own ideology, their own culture, their own legal training, their own politics, their own interpretation of the law. And we have to make arguments for each of the 14. When a prosecutor decides, am I going to launch a criminal investigation of Mr. Vladimir Putin for the crime of aggression? That's an individual decision. Sure, the individual is wearing the hat of the office of the prosecutor of some country, or of the ICC, or of some other special tribunal if such a thing is created. And what I've come to understand, and that I didn't understand as a law student, this is for the law students amongst you, I know some of you are law students, is the law is not something that is mechanically created or mechanically applied. Lauterpacht and Lemkin, students in this city who walked the street, who invented these terms of crimes against humanity and genocide, they weren't acting pursuant to diktat by particular governments who were saying, go away and invent us some ideas, please. No. They just had their ideas and they wrote them out on bits of paper and then they tried to persuade other people to run with it. And it's exactly the same process here. And in the end, some of the outcomes that will occur in this story will be dependent on the character, the quality, the skills, the weaknesses, the predispositions of particular individuals. And in making your arguments, now I'm talking about the kinds of arguments we make here, I describe it in the book, we prepared our arguments by spending hundreds of hours looking at the personal stories, histories, writings, decisions of each of the 14 judges. And when you stand before the court and make an argument, you're not making an argument for 14 judges. You're making 14 individual and distinct arguments, which are fine-tuned for each of them. And if any of you appear before an international court, that's what you've got to do. Some of the judges hate each other. Okay? And the fact that that judge has gone in that direction means that the other judge is going to go in the opposite direction. So you have to find a way, like any community, to get them to all go in the same direction. Ukraine has achieved a very good decision from the International Court of Justice at one level. There was no genocide, and there is no genocide taking place in eastern Ukraine against ethnic Russian nationals. Then the court decided to go further. And I worry that this is going to be a problem. The court essentially ruled in a provisional measures order that the invasion was illegal under international law. And I wonder whether that was a wise thing for the court to do over the longer term. Because it's going to have to backtrack from that. Not because that view is wrong, that happens to be my view, but because the court only had jurisdiction over the crime of genocide. It didn't have jurisdiction in relation to the UN Charter, Article 2.4, Article 51, and all of these things. And what you learn in life is that when a court goes too far on one day, at some point later, it has to pull back. And I worry a little bit that having gone as far as it has, for reasons that are very understandable in the face of a particular moment, will it at some point have to row back? I describe another story about courts that are really relevant to that. In 1966, the International Court of Justice, in the single worst decision it has ever given. In a case called Southwest Africa, Ethiopia and Liberia versus South Africa ruled that Ethiopia and Liberia had no legal interest in how white South Africa treated the black inhabitants of the then colony of Southwest Africa. It's an absolutely terrible decision. And that decision caused the global South to say we will have nothing to do anymore with the International Court of Justice. It's a white man's tribunal. And for 25 years, they had no cases at the International Court. And still today, there is skepticism. I recently did a consultation on a potential case with the government of Ethiopia. And they said to me, we will never go to the International Court of Justice because of this judgment. In 2010, I got handed down the second worst judgment of the ICJ in my lifetime. Georgia versus Russia. When the court ruled it didn't have jurisdiction in relation to the claim that Russia was discriminating against ethnic Georgians in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and it did so on a legal technicality that Georgia had not properly notified the Russians of their desire to bring a case in relation to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The case turned on, ultimately, in my view, a single change of judge at the International Court of Justice. British judge who was pro-human rights retired and was replaced by a new British judge who's very anti-human rights. And it was as simple as that. And I think that the decision on provisional measures now, this year in 2022, in part is a reaction against the court having got it so wrong in 2010. I've written in this book, that by declining jurisdiction in 2010, the court was in effect signaling to Russia, you can do this. Don't worry about us. You can go and you can discriminate to your heart's content and we'll find a way, because you're a big country, to protect you. And I think the court effectively enabled Russia afterwards in Chechnya, afterwards in Crimea, afterwards in Eastern Ukraine, then in 2022. Essentially, there's a pattern of behavior, and the court said, we'll stay out of it. That's what they said. And I think the court is partly responsible for what happened.
What would you, so here's something that troubles me endlessly that hopefully you can clear up for me. What do we do when state actors or other actors simply refuse to accept the judgments that are passed down, right? So here you're talking about instances in which cases aren't taken up or the decision goes a certain way, but what happens otherwise when we're dealing with, I mean, we're going back to Resolution 1514 here, right? Self-determination, territorial integrity, well, Russia's sitting there with a veto, right? So what do we do then? How do we make these institutions work if states can flout the decisions?
So without saying too much, we are right now in a very interesting moment on Chagos, because the British government appears to be coming very close to realizing that its position is untenable and it's paying a very big price. And we can see imminently a very significant change and possibly even a complete resolution of this story, which would be a very good thing. That in part is because there is domestic pressure in the United Kingdom, where the population cares about lawlessness and double standards and hypocrisy, but not all countries are like that. I think the answer that I'm going to give you, Kate, is not a particularly satisfying one. I'm not naive. I'm not starry-eyed about international law. International law is a very long game. The 1945 moment was huge. It was a revolution. All of a sudden, states could no longer do in international law what they wanted. They couldn't kill their citizens, they couldn't kill groups, they couldn't do this, they couldn't invade other countries. You can't expect a rule to come down from somewhere miraculously, and all of a sudden countries are going to say, oh, okay, we're going to behave ourselves. It'll all be fine. When I was a young international law researcher at Cambridge University, I had a fantastic colleague, a very distinguished, the most famous professor of English legal history in England, Sir John Baker. wonderful human being. And once a month he would invite me for lunch. And he would say, what are you working on? And I'd say, I'm working on this, or I'm working on that. And he'd go, yes, we had a similar problem in English law in 1472, and it took 273 years to sort it out. And that's the optimistic take, you know. Russia is lawless. China is lawless. Actually, sometimes the UK and the US are lawless. And it's a long game. It doesn't mean we give up and say, oh, it's all hopeless and useless. And you live through these terrible moments, like now, where there's utter lawlessness and mass murder and terrible acts. But you have to keep your eye on the big picture over the long term. That's particularly for the students. It's just the way the history of international law is. A little bit of construction, and then disaster strikes, and there's a conflict, and everything collapses. But every single time, 1850, 1940, 1945, they always rebuild on what came before. They don't just say, oh, we get rid of the whole thing. They always take what they had before and say, we'll make it better, and we'll improve it. And it's plain that the international legal order today is not fit for purpose. Okay, the permanent members of the Security Council is an absurdity. It's a 1945 thing. Why the UK and France are permanent members of the Security Council in 2022, frankly, it is ridiculous. You know, there are other countries that play a bigger role, or other regions and blocks that play a big role. So at some point, the system will collapse. Maybe we're in a pre-collapse stage now, and then it'll be rebuilt and restructured, and human rights won't disappear, and genocide as a crime won't disappear, and they'll restructure it and they'll do it in a different way. And I think that's the only way that we can go. You know, I've got cases. I was counsel for the Philippines against China on the South China Seas case, and China said, fuck off. We don't like this judgment. Go away. We're going to ignore it completely. But they can't. They haven't ignored it completely. We've got a problem with the Philippines. So slowly, behind the scenes, subtly, face-saving way out and give them a little bit. I don't know what will happen with Russia, but it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where we wake up one morning and suddenly Mr. Putin's gone, because that's how it'll happen. He'll just be gone. And there'll be some new person there, probably a man. And the man will say, it was all his fault, Putin, let's put him on trial. Let's put him on trial and do all of the crimes. And it's not us, it's not our responsibility as a state. His fault. There's 8 people around him. So you just don't know how it's going to go. And I think for those of us who care about the idea of a rules-based system, you just carry on. And you just stick to your principles, you stick to your guns, however difficult, and you just, you know, carry on.
And I think this is with carrying on, it's a good moment for invite our audience for questions. So please, you know, think about a question or comment or something that resonated with what Philip has said, or what you think.
Yeah. And feel free to ask any questions.
Or any question.
I mean, we've touched on a wide range.
Let's have a conversation. So,
I'm very, very, very interested to know what you think. It's of great
just
interest.
raise hand and Sophia will help with mic.
So hello. I have so many questions I would like to ask, but I will limit myself to just 2 probably. So this idea about colonialism and how it relates to Ukraine and Russia and the current situation. And in the past, we not often looked at our region and the former Soviet Union and now Russia as a colonial state, and Ukraine as a former colony to some extent, because traditionally colonies are some outseas land, you know, this salt water test and everything. So colonies are somewhere far abroad. And if it's your neighbor that you colonize and oppress, then it's not a colony in traditional sense. So yesterday, Ukrainian parliament adopted very interesting resolution. So it's a call to international community to support the self-determination of oppressed peoples of the Russian Federation. So what do you think about that? And the second question, more simple, what is the next book gonna be about?
Do you want to take 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, let's actually
Just
see
so
if
then we
there
can
are
share them.
question, comments, something. Okay, we can deal with two. Oh, Bogdan has one. So Bogdan, so one, and then
My question is about the practices and definitions, because you often said like empire, and then for many people empire is something positive because it allows various people to live together. Then imperialism in Soviet tradition is something bad. And is it basically, I mean, in a possible future, like, do we still have the possibility to have an empire without imperialism?
That's definitely.
So, in an attempt to kind of think about the questions of self-determination and imperialism, empire without imperialism, I think one of the things as a historian I'm going to say is that the countries we have now are not predetermined, right? These are also evolving, changing over time, and so I think it's reasonable to think about the Russian Empire having been constructed since Ivan Grozny, right? And what are we going to do? How are we going to think about that? What is going to happen there? It's at least something that needs to be an open question, right?
Something we can dream about.
I mean, obviously, exciting thing if we could come up with a way to do it, right? I mean, I think which comes first, imperialism or empire? I feel like imperialism comes first, and can we kind of get rid of that? I struggle to see how, but we can reclaim the idea of people living together in this sort of shared community without the power hierarchy that an empire imposes.
I mean, would we need a new word for that?
Exactly.
I mean, that's also the question. Where's this word? Because we also know that over the last 20 years there was more nuanced scholarship of like new imperial history, saying that nation state was emancipatory, but also had the problems, couldn't deal with minorities. Empires were problematic, but they were, we see more nuances in, especially Ottoman Empire, very understudied, underappreciated, of living cohabitation in diversity. And this diversity, could be religious, could be ethnic, but actually diversity is not only about religious and ethnicity. It could be different kinds.
Exactly.
And that's a question, can we, we're not striving to the smallest and most homogeneous entity where everybody is the same, because that's basically you end up with you as a person, and then you open the question of how many personalities you have in your head. So this is the question of how to live in complexity and how we can have different types of entities that enable peaceful and creative and sustainable and coexistence, and not only for among ourselves as human beings, but also let's think about beyond anthropocene. Let's think about, and we are thinking about nature, about, animals, do they have rights? And then so on and so on. You can open that, that's on, and that's a question, I think, to this direction would be more. But here it's, to Philip, you.
When I was standing up before the International Court of Justice in September 2018 and making the opening argument for Mauritius. I read out parts of a letter that Boris Johnson had written. It was his letter of resignation. He had been the foreign minister of the United Kingdom. He had been a catastrophically terrible foreign minister of the United Kingdom. And thanks to him, in large part, Mauritius was able to get the resolution through the General Assembly. He was the secret weapon of Mauritius, very frankly, because he'd written some terrible articles describing black people in very pejorative ways. And in a globalized world, delegates, UN had all read his articles and knew his views about colonialism. But in his resignation letter, bless him, he wrote, literally, I'm quoting, "No country wants to be a colony." Okay. And he was referring to the United Kingdom's relation to the European Union. For him, the European Union is a colonial power, okay? Because it is imposing on poor little sad England all these rules that it hasn't consented to and the Parliament hasn't voted for, and it's causing us to take all these ridiculous positions on all sorts of things. And he resigned because of Theresa May's Brexit withdrawal bill, which gave too much power to the European Union. Fast forward a few years to Ukraine, which wants to be a member, it seems, of the European Union. So on Johnson's analysis, the desire of Ukraine to be a member of the European Union is, in fact, but you don't know it, a desire to be colonized. You want another entity to exercise power over you effectively without your full consent. That's his basic position. So it's a way of saying two things. First, both the questions are really complex, because whether you are imperial, the colonizer, or the colonized is a matter of perception and the place from where you stand. I mean, some people will say that by accepting support, weapons, the money from the West to fend off Russians, a dependence is being created, which is effectively going to impose upon generations of Ukrainians to come a situation of essentially serving as a new colony. And I don't know Ukraine that well. I've only been 25 times in the last 10 years. But I'm beginning to get a sense that it's a very special place, that actually it is a sort of transitional country, that it doesn't fit easily into belonging in this place or belonging in that place. It has a different quality, and I've come to understand that and respect that. And so when I see stuff about pulling Ukraine into NATO, I don't for a moment say that justifies what Putin did. It doesn't, not for a single millisecond. But it gives a pretext that something is happening. I go back in my book to a moment in 1941 when Churchill and Roosevelt met. It's an absolutely crucial moment on a boat off the coast of Newfoundland, another British colony, and they signed a single sheet of paper called the Atlantic Charter. For the students, go on the web and find the original document with Churchill's manuscript on it. It's completely fascinating. Roosevelt arrives on the boat and he's got a draft. Okay, but it turns out Roosevelt is a lot smarter than Churchill. And he doesn't tell Churchill what he wants out of the text. They talk and they share ideas, and then he says, you go and draft the text, okay? You go. And then you come up with your piece of paper. And Churchill says, well, have you got any ideas? And I said, well, not really, but here's some things we've got. So Churchill goes away, and Churchill and his secretary type up the things, and they take some of the language of Roosevelt. It really is a brilliant story. And one of the ideas in the Atlantic Charter is the idea that, people should not be oppressed and they should decide for themselves how they're going to control their destiny. And essentially, this is a reflection of Roosevelt's desire to destroy the British Empire. That's what the Atlantic Charter is about. Kill it. Finished. And we come instead.
Exactly.
And Churchill doesn't realise what's going on. The Atlantic Charter is signed. It really is. As students, go and have a look at it. It's really fascinating. And what happens? In South Africa, a young man called Nelson Mandela sees the Atlantic Charter in a newspaper and says, holy shit, this is great. We're going to be able to own land. We're going to be able to vote. We're going to be able to do all those things. And Churchill goes back to London, and in Parliament, in Westminster, everyone goes, well, what have you signed? What is this thing that's... And he says, Churchill says, no. This is only for people who are subject to domination by Nazi Germany. It doesn't apply to the British colonies. It's crazy when you read back to it. So the answer to the two questions is that it's in the eye of the beholder. You've got to, I think, go back to the essence of what the exercise of imperial or colonial power is. It's about power. It's about one community exercising power over the other, where the other has not had an appropriate possibility to consent truly to what it is being asked to do. And that's the crucial aspect of it, whether it's on a micro scale within a family or within a town or within a single country or across countries. It's about the desire of one person or one community or one country to exercise power over another. And that's fine if the person or community or country over which power is exercised has genuinely consented to it. But if they haven't, that becomes the exercise of imperial power. I haven't had a chance to respond to your question, but there will be a third book in the East-West Ratline trilogy, which concerns, just very briefly, a man called Walter Ralph. So just as Otto Wächter, who lived here in this town, was a minor character in East-West Street, where Hans Frank was the main character, in the Ratline, Wächter becomes the main character, but one of the minor characters is his friend Walter Ralph. Walter Ralph is the inventor in 1941 of the mobile gas chamber used on the territory of Ukraine, the little vans that would drive around and gas 40 or 50 people in different towns. Walter Ralph's idea, Walter Ralph built them, Walter Ralph fixed them, Walter Ralph operated them, and so on and so forth. But somehow, in 1945, he escaped. He runs around Europe, ends up in Italy, lives with Wächter in a monastery in Rome, and then in 1949, he goes to Syria, and he sets up shop with a group of old Nazis in Syria, writes to Wächter, says, the Arab world, not a good place for Germans, they don't work hard enough, they don't do things like we do things, go to South America, don't go to Syria, it's not good. So he lasts a year in Syria, he then goes to back to Italy, and from Italy, he gets himself invited to Ecuador. And the man who invented the mobile gas chamber becomes an auto mechanic for Mercedes-Benz in Quito, Ecuador. Really couldn't invent it. He's with his wife, he's with his two boys, Walter Jr. and Alf, and he's there for the rest of his life until he meets an absolutely charming man who is the military attaché of the Chilean embassy in Quito. We're now in 1956. And the two men and their wives become friends. And the military attaché says, you're in the wrong country. You shouldn't be in Ecuador. You should be in my country, Chile. We like people like you. Come to Chile. So he moves to Chile in 1958. And he moves down south to the southernmost town in the whole world, where he survives a request from West Germany to extradite him back to West Germany for mass murder. Statute of limitations applies, 15 years, and therefore the events of 1941 can no longer be the subject of an extradition in 1963. And it becomes the manager of a fish cannery in Punta Arenas. And then, by some fantastic miracle, his friend, the military attaché, on September the 11th, 1973, becomes president of Chile, because the man's name is Augusto Pinochet. And all of a sudden, his friend calls him and says, I need you. I need your skills in Santiago. Come back to Santiago, and I will work with you. And 25 years later, when Augusto Pinochet comes to London, he is arrested and is subject to an extradition request, amazingly, for crimes against humanity and genocide, the crimes invented in Lviv. And into my desk arrives the request from Pinochet's lawyers to defend him from these crimes against humanity and genocide. It turns out for crimes committed also by Walter Rauff. So the story that began in Lemberg in 1904 with my grandfather's birth in this town follows this strange journey around the world, ends up in Chile and then comes all the way back to London on October the 16th, 1998, and into my desk. And we have a rule in the English bar, which is called the cab rank rule, the taxi driver rule, which is you can't decline a case because you don't like the person. So in theory, if Vladimir Putin is arrested tomorrow, sent to the United Kingdom, and says, I want Sands to defend me, we're not allowed to say, I don't really want to do this, unless we can find ourselves within one of the exceptions. So Pinochet gets in touch through his lawyers, and I'm sort of, I'm quite pleased. It'd be a big case, be interesting, and I believe in the cab rank principle, but I'm married to an American who thinks the cab rank principle is total bullshit, and whose mother is a Spanish refugee from the Civil War on the anti-Franco side, and who says to her lovely little husband, you think you're going to act for Pinochet? You act for Pinochet, I divorce you tomorrow. No, I don't act for Pinochet. And instead I declined instructions, and 3 days later the other side gets in touch, human rights watch, and say, would you like to act against Pinochet? So I said, go and ask my wife, can I act against Pinochet? She says, go for it. And that's the story. It's a very personal story about my relationship with my wife and crimes against humanity and genocide in the English courts. I mean, it's a funny way of saying, coming back to the current situation, the British people need a bit of humour and we laugh about things in a dark sense. This is a serious moment. We don't know what's going to happen. People ask me a lot, what will happen to Putin? I don't know what will happen to Putin, but it's not impossible that he's, if not killed, thrown out on some heap somewhere and ends up in some tribunal. You can't exclude that possibility. And I think people like me just have to keep going and raising the arguments, and we'll see what happens.
Some questions here? Yeah, we have 2 questions at least. So here, you have mics. Можна українською, можна англійською.
Hello. So it's working now, yeah. My question is probably going to be a little vague, but having listened to everything you say about the corruption in Western or global institutions, and
I didn't use that word.
Okay, well,
You've got to choose your words very, very carefully.
Okay, I had an impression that global West-made institutions are a little bit corrupt. The question that arises for me is that how do we choose our partners and who do we integrate with? If even those who claim to have the highest moral standards and are the most eligible applicants for that positions are actually corrupt. And yeah, that's my question basically.
And
It's a big question.
it's a big question. Peros has a question.
Hello. My question would go beyond human beings, probably, because I'm curious about the how it works with the international law when it comes to crimes against not humans, but probably environment. If it's eligible in the light of international law, because when it comes to this Russian aggression in Ukraine, it's not only aggression against human beings, but also aggression against environment, forests, fields, nuclear threat, and everything. And it's also probably part of colonialism, because colonialism is not about slavery only, but also about exploiting natural resources of certain colonies. So I'm curious whether, in case of this eventual future international trial against act of aggression in this differentiation that you mentioned, whether it's the crime against environment, is it somehow, I don't know, eligible, applicable, a valid argument in the prosecution case for this eventual trial?
And there is one more question before the over, so let's get 3 questions.
Are there any questions from men?
Yeah, so I mean, there are questions from two, here, so, but we will get. Yeah, so.
So thank you for coming and thank you for your solidarity. But I agree maybe with some other participants of this debate that what you have said was a bit disheartening to us, and disheartening because it partly fits to Putin's narrative that there are no rules, everybody plays with the rules, so we are like others, yes. So on the one hand, and on the other hand, what you said about little progress in Britain with this coming to term with this imperial legacy. And I'm afraid that the problem of Russia is not only Putin, and even if Putin died or something happened to him, still I think that what we have now is caused partly by the fact that Russia failed to come to terms with its imperial legacy in the 1990s, yeah. And if we think about some possible future when the war ended and we have a new Russia, so what do you think this coming to terms or working through this imperial legacy should include? So should it be only kind of change of education, revising of historical narratives, or also some legal steps should be taken, maybe declarative, maybe not only declarative? So how do you see?
You go ahead, yeah.
Well, gosh, these are really interesting questions. I'm sorry if I've been disheartening. I think you understand that is not my intention. And I am a believer in the rules, and I'm a believer in the courts. I traveled to Chagos in February. I went with Lizeby Elíze and Chagos. And if we didn't have international courts and international rules, she would have not set foot on her home island in the way that she did for the first time under armed British Guard. So I'm a passionate believer in rules. And one of the reviews that's just come out today of the book, because my problem is I'm too optimistic, and you're saying I'm too pessimistic. So I think I may have got it about right in terms of the balance. The world is as it is, and you choose your partners in a particular moment. When the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom decided to lend the United Kingdom's full support to Ukraine, I thought it was the right thing to do. And so I set aside my feelings of discomfort of having to publicly support an individual that I consider to be an abomination, because it was the right thing. And I think that means that sometimes you have to cast your lot in with some people who make you feel uncomfortable. You know, my anxiety right now is that the new British Prime Minister is somehow going to have to appoint this man to be somehow the special envoy for Ukraine, and I'm going to have to work with him, which I would find very difficult, but I would have to grit my teeth, as happens in difficult times, and keep your eye on the big picture, and do ultimately what you think is right. We all know it from our own personal life experiences. Being in an institution and having to work with someone you don't like or disapprove of, but on a project that ultimately you believe in. That's just life. And I think all I'm doing is describing the realities of the world. I believe in a rules-based system. I believe passionately in a rules-based system. But I'm realistic about how it works. I'm realistic about the odds, about the difficulties, about the challenges. And I think so long as we go into these initiatives with our eyes open, I think we'll be fine. And of course, Ukraine must accept support from the United Kingdom and the United States, but do it with your eyes open. Understand that at some point, something else will come along for these two countries. And all of a sudden, oh, we're not so interested in Ukraine anymore. There's this other thing that matters more to us. And that's how these countries function. And it's a two-way process. Ukraine can use these countries for now, and then Ukraine can decide, actually, on this question, who are we going to cast our lot in with? That is for the people of Ukraine to decide. That is for the people of Ukraine to decide which way they go, who they have their alliances with, who they have their relationships with, the nature of those relationships. And it's not for me as an outsider to say, you know, I may have my preferences, but ultimately it's for the system of governance of this particular country to decide how it's going to choose its partners, I think. And on the environmental issues, Paris, as you probably know, I've been very involved for the last 2 years, inspired largely by the work that I've done with incredible support of this centre. I just want to say loud and clear, you have an incredible centre here for urban history. When I arrived here in 2010 for the first time, knowing absolutely nothing about anything, this centre and this individual to my left in particular just helped me so much and so generously, and led me ultimately to discovering the remarkable role that the city of Lviv has in giving rise to the notions of crimes against humanity and genocide, which have changed our world, completely changed our world. You know, don't be disheartened. When the horrors of 1939 happened, there was no such thing as crimes against humanity. There was no such thing as genocide. There was no such thing as an international criminal court. There was no such thing as an international court of justice that could adopt provisional measures, okay? That is a pretty significant set of changes that have happened. And Ukraine is mightily assisted in the legitimacy of its struggle by being able to invoke pieces of paper with these words on it that say, you can't do that. So I don't think you should be disheartened, actually. I think you shouldn't be wildly optimistic, but you should be a little bit feeling your country has been helped by these inventions of the last 75 years. So inspired by Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and think about those two guys and what they did in 1944. They are alone. Every single member of their family, with one exception, in the case of both men, has just been murdered. They don't know it yet. They are completely on their own. What do? Do they go into the corner of a room, curl up and weep? No. They pick themselves up. They say, we have ideas about how to make the world a better place. They write their books, they persuade governments, and these new concepts emerge. And it's exactly the same with what's going on now. I think the Ukraine situation will lead to a big push on a project that I've been inspired by Lauterpacht and Lemkin, and that is a new fifth international crime of ecocide. The 4 crimes we currently have are all focused on the protection of the human. Very important, obviously. But we've come to understand the importance of our environment. And in international criminal law, there is a big gap. In terms of this current conflict, the only rules which exist on harm to the environment are using the environment as an instrument of war. And there was some situation 2 or 3 weeks ago where the Russians were targeting dams. That plainly, in my view, violates the provisions of international humanitarian law, which says you cannot use the environment, flooding places, in order to harm people and harm a military effort. The nuclear power plants is a real problem, and there are rules of international humanitarian law that limit the targeting of areas around ultra-hazardous facilities. But that is not to protect the environment, it's to protect humans. And so the gap in the law, which, I always look on the bright side, one of the consequences, I think, when the dust is settled in this terrible conflict, is to make people realize that this conflict has been dreadful for the environment, as all conflicts often are, and there is a gap that needs to be filled. And there is now a growing movement in favor of the concept of ecocide. I mean, again, for the, I'm a law professor, so I'm very often my words are directed to law students. The best law review article I ever read, still today, 40 years after I started studying law, was published in 1972 by an American academic called Christopher Stone. And it's called Should Trees Have Standing? And it posited the legal idea that nature should have rights. He was referring to domestic law in the United States. But the same idea has now emerged in the international domain. And young people in particular are really, really pushing this idea. When I was appointed to be co-chair with a wonderful Senegalese jurist, Dior Falsalo, and The Guardian ran an article saying Sands and Fallow have been co-chairs of this new international working group to come up with a definition of ecocide. It's the only time in the history of my life that all 3 of my children wrote me a WhatsApp and said, "Finally, Dad, you're doing something useful." Okay? And I thought that was really interesting. But for your generation of young people, this is really, really important. And I hope one of the things you take and run with from this terrible conflict is to really push this idea in the time of climate change.
The thing that I would just want to underline, and I think that this is something that I know you also share, is that it is not right that you should have to be doing this work right now. It is not right that you should be experiencing this to have to make these steps forward in international law, right? It is not fair that you have to think through who are we going to align ourselves with, do the hard work of figuring that out. And I just want to come back and emphasize that we are sitting here because we are firmly convinced of that. And we are doing and will continue to do everything we can to make that point to the rest of the international community. And so I mean, like everything that Philippe is saying here is so important to hear and know, but I also want to come in with this backup to just say, we can't believe that this is happening and that you're having to deal with this. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being, and thank you for working. And I think that, to conclude, not with thanks, but with the book which we started, and I think that at the core of this, and in some way also relating to your question, there is a question of power. We have so many examples here, there, now, in the past, when power is abused, misused as an instrument of domination, instrument of injustice. But we also know that there's a power of doing something good. It also, there are different kinds of power. And I think that this is really of what you also, Philip, has said about this very paradoxical situation in which we are now in Ukraine, which I, sometimes think that we have on one hand in relation to our subjectivity. So we have on one hand growing dependency. So our budget economically needs monthly, I don't know, 5 billions. So we need weapons, we need money. So our debt is growing. But at the same time, our subjectivity is expanding, which kind of, is like a glitch in the system. And I like this glitch because it opens a way to rethink what power is, not only for country and society like us, but also for countries and societies which are majority in this world, which are vulnerable. But vulnerability is also means dependency, and dependency doesn't have to be in bad way, because dependency means connections. Dependency means that we can be supportive, solidarious. And I think this is also one way of reading this book, thinking at how we here in the city of Lviv can feel empathy to a story of a Chagosian woman and her search and fight for home and the right to visit cemeteries and of her grandparents. And we can think of the homes and cemeteries which are here, and for people who can't visit them. And just today I was walking, and I will end on a little image. I was walking down Copernica Street, and there was like not eardropping, but just walking, and the two women were standing and saying, there's this apartment, and this apartment, poles left and all dishes stayed. And this was like, really, I was thinking that today, as we are talking, how this is the constant revisiting and visiting of the past. And I think we have so much to do right on the Copernica Street, but also in relation to Chagosian islands, and to see and notice more. We won't ever master to see and notice everything at the same time, but this is a really long path, which is both local and at the same time global. And this is about the power of connections and the possibility of solidarity and the possibility of a more just world we live in.
I did just want to come in on that, because at the end of the day, we haven't focused on it. It is a feel-good story. They prevailed. They got justice. They went to the international courts and they won. And they're going back. I mean, there's no question of whether they will get to go back now. And they will reclaim their homes and their lives. And it is exactly right of Sophia to say what she has said. And I think sitting here in Lviv, you may not get the full sense that Kate has expressed of this extraordinary admiration and solidarity with what is going on in this country. I mean, it is remarkable what has happened. That a country that is smaller, less wealthy, less well-armed, has defended itself. And everyone has seen that it has defended itself, because there is a human solidarity which is incredibly uplifting for a lot of people around the world, not just over here. So for us to be here, as Kate says, is immensely moving and a privilege, frankly. And I think when this horror story is over, I think friendships and relations will have been created, which will, I suspect, have a huge impact in terms of the influx of visitors, of investments, of monies. And I don't think for a single moment that when this war is over, people will just go, okay, that's over, we move on to the next project. I think from Western Europe's perspective, my sense is this is now a really long-term project. And for the young people in this room, that is a really hopeful and wonderful thing. I mean, what Ukraine has done is astonishing and hugely impressive. And the struggle is not over, and no one takes anything for granted. Everybody knows that. But honestly, big respect from around the world for what's going on in this country, because it is astonishing. I just wanted to underscore what you said.
Thank you. Дякую. Центру запрошення.